Okay, so hey everyone, welcome to the second event in the Integral Altruism speaker series. Um, I'm pleased to introduce Gordon Worley. Gordon has been involved with the rationality community since the late 1990s, from the Extropians and SL4 mailing lists, and he still writes on Less Wrong and his Substack, Uncertain Updates. He's a Zen practitioner and founded the Phenomenological AI Safety Research Institute, where he explored AGI alignment using phenomenological methods. His current work centers on epistemology, especially the problem of the criterion, which he has written a book about, and the intersections of contemplative practice, phenomenology, and the foundations of knowledge. Today, he'll sketch a short history of post-rationality, how it emerged from within the rationalist community, and where it stands now. And just to give a quick overview of the schedule, Gordon will talk for 20 to 30 minutes, maybe, basically as long as he feels like. Then we'll open it up for some Q&A and discussion. And if there's any time remaining, we might do some breakout rooms so with some small group discussions. We'll just kind of play that bit by ear. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Gordon. Welcome, Gordon.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. This is kind of exciting to get to talk about this stuff. I occasionally grab people at a conference and they'll ask me questions about this, or we'll just get on this topic. And it's kind of fun because I think that there's a lot of interesting history here in the community, and it's not very well documented. So having opportunities to capture this stuff is, I think, kind of helpful for, especially now that we're further on and there's actually some history to tell. Whereas for a long time there wasn't, because it was all just sort of new and fresh. So yeah, as Jack said, I want to talk about sort of the history of the post-rationalist movement as I think of it. And maybe before I jump into that, it's worth saying a little bit about what do I mean by this post-rationalist movement, right? Just so that we're defining terms a little bit here. So it's obviously defined in terms relative to the rationalist movement, by which I specifically really mean the movement that's centered around the community that grew out of the sequences that Eliezer Yudkowsky wrote, and then grew into this community around Less Wrong and CFAR and other sort of related organizations, and then developed also in person in Berkeley, where we had an in-person rationalist community. And you'll also notice that I'm always very careful to use the word rationalist as opposed to rationalism. This is mostly or I'll say rationality versus rationalism. And this is really just to help make a clear distinction between, this sort of movement and this only tangentially related philosophical position that happens to inconveniently share, roughly the same name. So that's just to help offer a little clarity here about what I'm talking about. And so then the post-rationalist community really grows out of this, right? In that we have a rationalist community, and then there's a set of us that kind of, maybe in integral theory talk, we want to transcend, extend and transcend this thing that rationality is. All right, so getting into the history of it, it really starts, in my mind, in Berkeley. And this is maybe around 2014, 2015. I'm a little bit fuzzy on exactly when this was. But I remember, in my mind, it really all coalesced actually at this house party. So, I don't know, these still happen in Berkeley, right? But the social scene really evolves around these house parties that happen, where, one of the group houses where we all live decides to throw a party for whatever reason. There could be no reason, there could be a theme or not. And, then, I don't know, 50, 100 people show up, cram into a single house, right? And we talk about stuff, right? there's dancing, there's drinking, there's like lots of philosophizing. It's generally a fun time. And yeah, one of these parties, there was like sort of like this extended conversation that started between myself, Malcolm Ocean, and Ethan Ashkey. And if you don't know who the two of them are, that's fine. Malcolm is a little more public online, so you may be more familiar with him, or you can like find his writing. And he and Ethan had been getting into Keegan, Robert Keegan's work, and they've been reading it. And so we were having like kind of a conversation about it. It went well into the night. I think that particular house party, Malcolm disappeared at some point. Ethan and I stayed up till like sunrise talking about this stuff. Really getting involved into it. And from there, we formed sort of what I would maybe like, this is maybe like a little grandiose to refer to it this way, but we formed something like a philosophical circle, right? We had a book club. That is like the official structure of it. But it was mostly just an excuse to get together every like 2 to 3 weeks and talk about whatever we had been reading in this space of how do we like be rationalist, but like actually win, right? And I think this is like the seed of it, right? Like we looked around and we're like frustrated with the fact that, we had all these friends that were like going through CFAR, which for anyone who doesn't have context, CFAR offers these like rationality training seminars to try to teach people how to be better at applying the lessons of rationality that existed within Eliezer's sequences, how to make these things real and bring them into your life. And so we had lots of friends that have like done these things, right? We were like, yeah, but all of our friends still kind of suck, right? Like, not that they were like bad people, right? Like, not in that sense, but they were not actually succeeding at making their lives better. They were not actually like achieving their goals in the ways that we would hope that they would be able to. And so there was something here around like, okay, what's missing? What is the problem? And I think that we didn't quite know how to like, didn't have like the whole answer at this point, but I think the direction we were going in was, well, what's missing is like the embodied piece, is the like integration of this into life, and how to actually do this. It's not enough to be able to sit down, carefully reason this stuff out, and then have like a theory. You have to actually live it, and the actual process of living it is quite a bit more complex and nuanced than sitting down and doing some like calculations on paper or writing a blog post about how you're going to like solve the world's problems, right? Actually solving the world's problems is quite a bit harder than writing about it. Kind of obvious when I say it that way, but the rationalist community has this real bias towards the idea that, hey, maybe if like we apply intellect and smarts hard enough and better than people have done in the past, we can achieve better. And it's not like a terrible intuition. This does work sometimes, right? There are lots of problems that are like low-hanging fruit that can basically be solved by just thinking about it harder, because nobody had bothered to think about it very hard before. But I think they make the mistake of overgeneralizing from those examples and thinking that this is like a general strategy that will work all the time, not a strategy that works in isolated cases where people have not tried hard enough, essentially, we could say. Okay, so back onto the story here a little bit. So we did have this like this post-rat circle, as I'll call it, made up of myself, Malcolm, Ethan, several other people that sort of came in and out. Two other people that I think are important are one guy, his name is Mike Plotz, and another person who's important but wasn't directly part of our like circle at this time is a guy named Michael Valentine Smith. You maybe you know him, maybe you don't. He was one of the instructors at CFAR. Sort of was part of the like early, like an early part of the in-person like rationalist community, um, as it was sort of getting formed around like 2011 or so. Um, and he would later like link up with us a little more directly. But at that time, he was still more like heavily invested in the CFAR world and trying to make the rationalist project itself, into something. Um, but anyway, at this reading group that we had, we there were a few books that were pretty important that we read, or I think of as important. These are sort of like the foundational texts of how we went from what was initially like, okay, we're steeped in this like rationalist community and the readings of it, but there's something missing and we were trying to figure out what that was. So the important books here were Inner Game of Tennis. I think that's the first book we read. If you've not read Inner Game of Tennis, it is, on the surface, it is a book. It's a sports book about how to get better at tennis, right? It's written I believe in the 70s originally, because this is around the time that like tennis had like skyrocketed in popularity. And so lots of people were playing it. Lots of people wanted to be better at it. But it's actually secretly a book about Zen. And by the end of the book, the secret is mostly out. Other than I can't remember if he's very explicit about like saying that like he's bringing in all this like Buddhist terminology stuff, but that's essentially like what the book is by the end of it. Impro by Keith Johnstone. That was another really important book. Impro is a book about like improvisational theater. But it contains some really important concepts in it that turned out to be like essential for what I think of as like the core of post-rationalist thought. Maybe one of the most important 2 chapters in this book are about mask work and trance states. And just to very briefly say something about this, mask work is essentially when you do improvisational theater, but it's based in like sort of like shamanic rituals, really, that like people have been doing for thousands, tens of thousands of years, where people literally put on a mask and then become like the character. They inhabit the character that the mask represents. And this points to like some interesting like aspects of human psychology that I think were like really important for us to explore. The other part that's connected with mask work is trance states. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here around what we can think of as trance states. I think like we can take like a fairly expansive view of trance states and think of them not as these like special, they can be these like mystical things, but they can also look like I'm hyper focused on the work I am doing in front of me, right? Like they don't have to be this like strange mystical thing. They could just be like, I am hyper focused on like writing this thing, or writing some code, or like drawing a picture, or whatever it is. That also sort of like qualifies. Even driving, you can get into a trance state while driving. It's not, but it's kind of like offered a window into like some interesting aspects of human psychology. So they turned out to be like really important for us to get into. I did mention Robert Keegan already, so his work was quite important. We read like The Evolving Self and In Over Our Heads, and I think maybe he had 1 or 2. I guess he had a couple of books out at that time that he'd written with Lisa Leahy, and then I think a couple more books have come out like since then that they've produced. We also spent quite a bit of time with, he worked with Lisa Leahy. She was one of his grad students. And then they produced this like manual for doing what's called like the subject object interview, which is a way of essentially assessing someone's cognitive developmental level in Keegan's system. So we spent a bunch of time with that manual and like interviewing each other and trying to figure this stuff out. So that was kind of fun. Really getting inside this theory before I think like, now there's much better like explainers online. Those things like didn't exist. We had to like read the source material to produce the explainers. And then, other things that were important were David Chapman's Meaningless book. I'm sure many of you have engaged with that. It was in a much rougher state of whatever 15 years ago or whatever the timeline is here. There was like a lot interesting there. I think there were like a lot, like David does a great job of like pulling together a lot of like disparate threads. So that was really useful for us to read and like provided a lot of like stuff for us to talk about and think about. And then I also want to throw in here that because this will become important in a second, that we were also reading Ribbon Farm. So if you're not familiar with the Ribbon Farm blog, this was you probably know him as like Viger on Twitter. What is his Venkesh? I think that's how you say his name. I'm drawing a blank here. I realize now I have to say his name out loud, and I don't remember. Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you. And Sarah Perry. And there were a couple other people on Ribbon Farm, but they were like sort of like the two key folks here. And their writing was, definitely like quite interesting to us. And it turned out to be important because it actually linked us up with sort of a larger movement of folks that were not in the space of the rationalist movement, but were very interested in similar ideas and had come to them from like sort of a different direction. Maybe not quite like the reified rationality of the rationalist movement, but very much from like a modernist rationalist perspective. And then looking to figure out, okay, like what sort of beyond that, right? I will say that I didn't write a note about this, but there was at some point further down the line, someone read Ken Wilber and pointed us in their direction. I think there was actually this guy, Matt Goldstein, who I don't know if any of you are familiar with. I think he's the one that maybe like introduced us to Ken Wilber and integral theory. And that was kind of interesting, but by the time we read Wilber, this is maybe like 2017, 2018. Like I think we kind of already worked out all these ideas for ourselves. So we were like, okay, yeah, like we're like, yeah, sure, this guy's like basically correct. Like he's offering an alternative explanation of this stuff, to the way that we are, but is definitely thinking along the same lines. So yeah, so that I'm not quite like through the whole thing, but this is maybe like a good stopping point because I've said a lot of stuff, to open it up to ask for people to ask questions if you have any like stuff you have questions about before I continue the story.
I know I have some questions, but I think my questions are best saved for after you finish the story.
Okay.
So, but if anybody else wants to hop in now before he continues, feel free.
I have a question. Like, how do you think about the relationship between post-rationality and like Chapmanian meta-rationality?
Yeah, I think these are like basically the same thing. I think that like we have different words for them basically for historical reasons, right? The reason I've talked about post-rationality is that we weren't actually originally like thinking of ourselves as post-rationalists, right? I think like I'm the person that like started using this terminology within the group and got us like calling ourselves this sort of. And it was largely because I had been thinking a lot about like sort of the postmodernist transition, right? So I was reading a lot more philosophy than everyone else was. Um, and I was really looking at a lot at sort of what happened in this process in the early 20th century, where we go from what are sort of like the seeds of modernism uh, in philosophical thought that develops over like the 17th and 18th and then through the 19th century. And then how we got to like postmodernism, which really sort of developed out of, the seeds of it really happen around like around 1900 or so, late like 1880s, 1890s, in reaction to industrialization. It pushed philosophers to um, really like grapple with sort of like the loss of humanity within like the modernist project. There's like lots of people like didn't really catch up to this until later. I think like as a whole society like did not fully like grapple with this until maybe like really like the post World War II era. But philosophers were dealing with it. Also, there's like sort of this strain where like um, in the 19th century, German philosophers were bringing in a lot of Buddhist thought into the European philosophical tradition. This also proved to be like a really like important mixing in order to create like what would become the postmodernist philosophical project. So I was getting very into this. I was reading like Husserl, I was reading Heidegger, and then Sartre, and then out of these, seeing like, okay, like there's something that like they got right that I felt like, and they like had some understanding of things, but then also looking at, okay, but like the postmodernist project like fell apart, and it sort of like crumbled in on itself with a bunch of like what I would now call like grifters, right? Like people that like weren't really part of this. And I think this is like maybe an interesting thing to bring up and gets me back onto the story, which is that like um, there's this like pattern where uh, uh, once you have like some sort of like way of understanding the world and then you like transcend it, this can also look like uh, the thing before you had that. So maybe to be more concrete about this, what I'm saying is that like the modernist project, right, uh, offered some improvements over what we were doing in sort of like the pre-modernist world. And then the postmodernist project tries to take all the good stuff out of modernism and then do something more, make it better, right? But it importantly is built on top of the scaffolding of modernism and can't exist without this like modernist project underneath it. But if you are coming to this fresh, right, like, and you are like some sort of pre-modernist, then postmodernism suddenly gives you cover to like do your stuff and maybe be like, you can pass yourself off as like a postmodernist, even though in fact like you don't understand modernism well enough to be a postmodernist. And then this whole thing like just sort of collapsed, right? Like it, and I think we see the same problem with rationality, where like I sort of view we have this like post-rationalist, meta-rationalist, you want to call it that, movement. It is really built on top of this foundation of rationality, and says like, hey, these are a lot of like really useful tools, but they're not enough on their own. We need to like integrate them into this larger system, or in fact like meta system, maybe we want to say, right? Because it's not really like a single system. It's much more nebulous than that. But it unfortunately gives a lot of cover for if someone wants to be pre-rationalist to like, sneak their way in, right? Because to the outside person that doesn't have enough knowledge of all of this, they sort of, it's hard to distinguish, right? It's hard to distinguish between the post-rationalist saying like, oh yeah, you got to like, uh, you know, uh, like integrate your understanding into your body, right? And like sort of a pre-rationalist perspective of like, that's like anti-intellectual. So I think this is like kind of a consistently tricky problem. And actually, this gets me back onto the story. So sorry, like interstitial question time, I guess, is over because I'm going to go back to the story. But it gets us onto this track of like I almost like very quickly regretted ever coining the word post-rationality, right? And I think that maybe other people feel perhaps the same way about meta-rationality because it gives this cover. So, as things continue to evolve, it really like, the in-person scene that we had to like just kind of fell apart. Over time, like people just moved on with their lives, right? We had kind of like explored these ideas and we like, they were no longer the like pressing things for us, right? Because we had like figured it out. And I was writing some things about it. Malcolm did. This is sort of where Val links up with this. Michael Valentine Smith. He writes a number of things about it. We're also now linked up with, sort of this like broader movement that's happening around like Ribbon Farm. It's now really like on Twitter. We see the seeds of what eventually become Teapot start to develop really out of this like Ribbon Farm, adjacent Twitter community. And then, it like grows from there, but then, we're now in sort of a place today where like the community is like fragmented, splintered, right? It's not really like one thing anymore. It's sort of too big to be one thing, right? So it can't keep coherence. But I think also there's just like, there's just what I want to say, like I was sort of like hinting at. There's like this sort of, I guess I'd say like grifter problem, right? Of maybe that's like ungenerous. If we go to like David's model, right? There's like the geek sociopath and mops model, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but I will assume that you are for the sake of argument here. And if you're not, we can talk about it. But essentially, like the mops and sociopaths showed up, right? And kind of diluted the community in some ways. However, because you are all willing to like jump on a call here, I'm just going to assume that you're all in the geek category, and you're all like the true believers of meta rationality, post rationality. So don't worry, you're all safe. And yeah, I think that's kind of like where we are today, right? We are in this place where it's not really one thing, and I think that there's like where I see like the post-rationalist movement, if it's even like a separate movement, really, going from here, is trying to thread like some sort of like tricky path here, of how do we like build a community that is like supportive of helping people move through multiple stages of development, right? And I think this is like quite interesting to people that are interested in like integral theory and other things. There's this like challenge, like I've already hinted at, of in some sense, like people need to move through like a modernist rationalist phase in their life before they can properly get to like a post-rationalist, meta-rationality, postmodernist type phase, and way of understanding. And without going through that, you can't actually get to that place, or so I would claim. Yeah, so I think that like this is like quite tricky. It's because it's very easy to like sort of like point people at one thing and say like, okay, like here's the example, just be like this, right? It's much harder to be like, actually, there are multiple phases to this. You are going to have to spend time being in the like not maximally correct phase of this thing, because it is actually like a developmental stage through which you have to move in order to get to the final one. Or if we even want to call it final one, right? Like I think that's maybe like not even the right terminology here. So yeah, I think that is like quite tricky to figure out, and it is like persistently the challenge of I think for like this type of community to figure out how to navigate that, and support the development of folks through stuff. And of course, traditionally, I think the way that we've done this is through things that look like organized religion. This is why I'm like quite big on, as Jack mentioned, I practice Zen, and I think one of the things that's really nice about Zen and some other forms of Buddhism is that they really create a space where this kind of like development can happen, and it is like managed in a way through like community structures and through your relationship with a teacher that help guide you through this without it becoming without the risk to like think that like, oh, I've totally got it, I've totally already like figured it out before maybe like at least like within the tradition we're willing to say, okay, yeah, you figured it out. So that's I think maybe that's all I really had to say. So I think I'll leave it there and we can open up for questions.
Well, thanks so much, Gordon, for the super interesting talk. I would ask everyone to just give him a quick virtual round of applause here, and then we can open it up to Q&A. Actually, I have a question. Maybe I'll go ahead and start with that, and then if people, oh, we can also do text chat if you can not unmute. But I think by default, maybe we can just unmute and ask questions as is natural, and or if people, like if you have a question and somebody's already asking a question, you could go ahead and raise your hand, and then I'll see you in the queue and I can call on you then. So yeah, so I guess my first question for you, Gordon, is something about sort of making sure how I can distinguish post-rationality from rationality. So it's sort of a three-part question I have for you here. So let me just say the three parts, and then
Sure.
I can restate if needed. So in your view, sort of what's the defining feature of post-rationality relative to like traditional rationality? The second part is like, so one objection that I've heard about sort of post-rationality, or at least the name post-rationality, is like, so if rationality can be described like Eliezer does as like the art of winning, right? Then anything that works is rationality by definition. So is post-rationality just rationality under a different label? So I'm curious to hear like your take on that sort of objection. And then the last part here is sort of like, just for you personally, what does or has post-rationality actually changed about how you make decisions and take action? What do you do differently now than when you were just a rationalist, so to speak?
Yeah. Okay, got it. What was the first part of the question again? Sorry, there were a lot of parts.
Sorry, what's like in your view? What's sort of the
the defining characteristic.
Post-rationality, rationality, or traditional
for
rationality?
that, I would say that like the defining thing is, is maybe just this word integration, right? Like I think maybe that sums it all up. There's a lot of like complexity hidden behind saying that, but that's fundamentally what I see as the difference, right? And maybe this gets into the second part of the question, right? Because I think you're right. Like this is a very common objection. I have responded to this objection so many times from people, right? They're like, why do we even need this, right? Like it, like rationality is supposed to be this like all-encompassing thing that like, right? And like if it's the way that works, then it is rationality. And I'm like, okay, yes, I think there is this like version of it that like you can believe, like, you can say that, right? But the thing that like is maybe like written into the sequences, or like the thing that like you believe is like the true rationality, right? It's just not like the on the ground reality of like what people are doing. There is this like I would say that like there's sort of this vibe that rationalists have, right? And I think it is actually based in a bunch of metaphysical assumptions that rationalists tend to make. I'm not saying that these assumptions are not like useful in some way and that they don't produce like good like accurate like world models, right? Like that I think is definitely true, that they do work for that. But they have these assumptions that, when taken to their extremes, lead them to believe that essentially they can pull off something like the traditional rationalism philosophical project, right? Like, I often describe it as your typical rationalist is secretly a logical positivist. And if you don't know what that means, logical positivism was this movement in philosophy, mostly in the first half of the 20th century. But it does actually stretch back a bit further, but it like really coalesces in the early 20th century, where people really went hard on this, trying to make this work. Where the idea is more or less that like we can positively construct an accurate explanation of the world from first principles. So you could provide like a logical accounting in mathematical terms of the entirety of the universe. The problem is that this just doesn't work. Now, people figured this out about, like the middle of the 20th century, like in the 50s and 60s. And like within the tradition of analytical philosophy, logical positivism is effectively dead. There are, definitely people that still like harbor sympathies towards it, but argument, like they're like clear definitive arguments that prevent this sort of like line of reasoning from working. So like from a technical perspective, does not work. Does not mean that like lots of people don't have sort of like an intuition that it should be true. That it should be true that like if we just think hard enough and do enough math and have an accurate enough world model, then actually like the map will fully describe the territory, right? I in fact don't even need the territory because I have the map. And as I say this, hopefully this all sounds like, okay, yeah, obviously this is like not right. But the problem is that like the assumption, like the assumptions that power this worldview are often like deeply baked in for people. And it can be hard for them to notice it. So, it means that like sometimes my arguments have to like veer into the world of like psychologizing people, because I think that like this is what's going on. So that's kind of why I think that we need something like post-rationality, meta-rationality, because people have these assumptions that something like logical positivism is possible. And we need really some way to like get people through that. Now, not everyone has this. Some people just like figure this out for themselves and like never get caught in these traps. But lots of people will explicitly say like, yeah, of course, like logical positivism is like not correct. That's not what I'm trying to do. And then I think they immediately turn around and act as if it were true. So that's where I really see the need here. And then what was the third part of your question? Sorry, I forgot.
Oh yeah, no worries. And it's funny that you were mentioning the logical positivism and the rationalism stuff, because I was just reading recently Popper's sort of takedown of like empiricism, rationalism,
Yeah.
logic. So that resonated quite strongly with me, your answer there. So thank you for that. The third part was just sort of what does or has post rationality actually change about how you make decisions or take actions?
That's right.
What do you do differently now than you did like a decade or two ago? When you were just a rationalist, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd say I'd have to go back quite a bit further, right? Like, because, and this gets a little bit complicated, right? Because for myself, I think this is really tied into, I don't know. I kind of can't answer this question, right? That's what I'll say, but I'll give you an answer anyway. The reason I sort of can't answer this question is because post-rationality didn't exist for me, right? Like I helped co-create it. So, but like the things that would become post-rationality, right? Or the cornerstones of it, for me, it was like some combination of like, for me, it's inextricably tied up with the process of like what in Buddhist terms we would maybe call like enlightenment or awakening, right? And like the path to that process. and maybe we don't want to like totally go down that route here, but like it basically like freed me from, I would say that like it was helpful for freeing me from my like ontology, from like the map of the world that I had, and like the narratives, the stories I was telling myself about how the world was, so I could actually engage directly with the world as it is. And this is like kind of tricky because early on, right, there's a point where you actually like, you can't see the story. You can't see that like all of your knowledge is like being, or at least for myself, like I couldn't see that all this knowledge for myself was being interpreted through this layer. I could not see the layer. It's like, you know, the fish swimming in the ocean, right? Like I couldn't see the water. So it was very helpful in the sense of like helping me like through that process of like breaking out of that, of being like trapped by my own beliefs. And, you know, really living in a place today where like, I don't know, I kind of just feel free to like act and think and do things. And I'm not so like caught up in the idea of them. I feel like that's underselling it, but like, I feel like that's the only way I can do it without like giving like a whole other talk about like enlightenment and all that kind of stuff. So we'll leave it there unless people have more follow-up questions about it. Okay, what question should I take next? I know people raised hands and I think there was something in chat.
Yeah, so I think Jamie had a question in chat, so let me just read that out, and then Rupert raised his hand, so I will go to him next.
Okay.
So Jamie's question was, I think this is about sort of the idea that you were describing about sort of stages of cognitive development, or like needing to become a rationalist, a modern rationalist, or whatever, before you can go to post-rationalism or post-rationality.
Yeah.
So why not train the skill directly rather than train for multiple proxies, i.e. rat and then post-rat? Like, is there a scope for an integrative post-rat sequences that has breaks for like art appreciation?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Yeah, I would say that like there sort of is, right? But it really requires that I don't know. This is like tricky, right? And I think, and you know, I don't think I'm the best person to solve this problem, right? Like I know that like David Chapman is, you know, trying to do some of this work in terms of like you know, he's written this book like in the cells of an eggplant, right, that is like trying to like help people move through this like second phase of things from like a rationalist starting point. I think it's quite tricky though, and it ties in with cognitive developmental theory. So the theory here is basically that in order to be able to make sense of what we think of as like I will like stop using multiple terms and I will just talk about post-rationality, but assume that I mean all these other like related things that are sort of like lumped together. In order to get there, it's only possible for our minds as they are structured by moving through these like developmental phases in order to develop the level of understanding needed. Because the problem is that like we're not actually trying to solve a problem of like intellectual understanding. That's not the issue at hand here, right? The actual issue is, how do you make yourself as a person, as a human being, capable of intuitively understanding this stuff? I often think about it in terms of like system 1 and system 2. Like, yeah, you can sort like, if you're smart enough, you can just like use system 2 to like think through this stuff explicitly, no problem, right? And in fact, many smart people do. In fact, many smart people succeed at being developmentally delayed because they are so smart, right? Because they can use system 2 very well to like deal with stuff, and system 1 is not actually forced to update. The project here is really, how do I update system 1? How do I update it so that like my first thought is in this like more complex framing, so that like I don't have to explicitly work out the details. I can just like intuitively hold this in my head. I wrote a blog post that might be of interest to folks here. Let me see if I can find the link real quick. about I called it like ontological I called it a model of ontological development. Here, let me drop this blog post in the chat. Where I try to lay out, I think, like an argument for why this sort of like structure is necessary. And it basically has to do with like the complexity of the thoughts that our minds are able to hold. And as a result of like this like nested structure of how much like structural complexity can you hold in a thought. And it I don't know that it's like 100% correct. Like I am not a professional psychology researcher, right? So you should take it all with a grain of salt here. But it is this like model of you need to be able to like hold a certain level of like complexity of structure in your mind at once intuitively, just to be like the native way that you think, and then to be able to have that as a foundation to add on to it. And sort of, you know, the punchline of this is that like we eventually get to a place where you can hold like a structure that's complex enough to actually model roughly anything that like actually exists in our world, and model the relationships between those things. But it requires developing, you know, these skills and having these insights so that that way this is like the native way you think. This is not like an explicit way you think in system 2. So that's sort of my answer there. Hopefully that's helpful. I know I kind of like went off on a tangent, but like that's why I think like we can't do this directly. We have to do it through this like progressive model, because fundamentally that's just like how our minds work.
Yeah, like if you learn to play the piano, you don't just sit down and play Beethoven, right? You got to like build up the skills to be able to do that. Is what I'm thinking there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know, like I trained as a mathematician, even though I did drop out of my PhD to get a job that paid much better. But it's the same. We have the same kind of thing in math, right? Like there are you know, like you don't learn to multiply before you learn to add, because multiplication just sort of doesn't make sense unless you have the intuitions around how addition works. And then similarly, exponents don't make sense unless you understand multiplication, right? And then this actually just extends endlessly in mathematics, to the point that we even have mathematics to codify this concept in category theory, right? Like where we have like a system of categories that are like built on top of each other, that is a mathematics of how these like structures relate and exist to each other. And so it, yeah, it's really just this like pattern that I think shows up everywhere.
Great. Let's go to Rupert for his question.
Thanks. Can I ask two things? First of all, you said the main motivation was to be more effective at winning. Did you actually try to measure how that was working out? And the other thing was, the Gemini language model told me Postrationality has made some criticisms of the effective altruism movement. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, so sorry, my memory is always a little fuzzy. What the first part of the question was, what again?
Did you try to measure?
Oh yeah, did I try to like measure my winning?
How
Yeah,
well
that's
you
right.
were
Sorry.
doing at winning? Yeah.
Sorry. I have like my memory is like I'm great at like procedural memory stuff, and I'm very bad at like my episodic memory is not always so great. So like I forget things almost immediately, but I'm great at remembering how to do things. Yeah, so in terms of winning and measuring it, not like explicitly, like I haven't like quantified it, like I haven't like put together a spreadsheet of like, you know, how much am I winning at my life, right? However, what I would say is that like, you know, having gone down this path, like, I see myself like, at least for myself, I can say this is true, right? Like, my life is dramatically better than it was like, I don't know, 15 years ago, right? And was it improved in ways thanks to rationalist stuff? Yes, of course. Was it improved even more by what I am lumping into like the post-rationalist project? 100%. Like, there's a lot of things about life that I think aren't really solved by like doing math about it, right? There were things that were like, I had like a lot of like what I would call like psychological shadow, right? Things like, what we could maybe call like codependent behavior, sort of low self-esteem issues. I was just kind of like depressed and anxious, like just a lot of this stuff. And there was no amount of like sitting down and thinking about it that could fix it. In fact, like the thinking about it arguably like made it worse. The things that I actually needed to do were much more like just getting out there and like having experiences that would help me like work through these like issues and get experiences that would show me that like, hey, actually like there's a different way to live and do things. But I like attribute a lot of that to what I'm considering this like post-rationalist strain of thought, because it really says like, in modern terms, we would say like, go touch grass, right? Like that's like fundamentally also one of the like, I think like core ideas of this like post-rationalist project. Whereas I think the what I often see rationalists doing, and what certainly I was doing before moving in this direction, was why do I need to touch grass? I can just like think about grass real hard, right? And that's like basically just as good as touching it. So I don't actually have to touch it. No real like actual measurement here of stuff, but I will say that like if I go back like 15 years ago, average day of my life was maybe like, I don't know, if I ranked it on a scale out of 10, I would say that most days of my life were like a 3 or a 4 out of 10, right? And now my life is like 9 out of 10, like every day. Now, look, I'll be totally honest that a bunch of this is because of like Buddhist related things, but I wouldn't have done any of that stuff if it wasn't for like bundled into this like post-rationalist project. So this is as much a pitch for post-rationality as is for Buddhism. So hopefully that answers your question some. But I know that it's like not a full accounting really. The other part of your question in terms of like criticisms of EA, I know that I myself have a lot of criticisms of EA, and I think maybe other post-rationalists do, mostly because many EAs are utilitarians. And there's a lot of stuff about utilitarianism that is, I think, just wrong, right? Like I think that's like as simple as that. I don't even have to like engage in this like maybe like on a philosophical level. I think that is just wrong in terms of like actually producing the best outcomes. And it's because utilitarianism has this sort of baked in idea of utility function, but it doesn't really address where utility comes from, right? Like this is not a like fully answered question within the framework. I think consequentialist thinking is quite important. It's important to think through like, what will be the effects of my actions, right? Like how does cause and effect work? I think many of the like weird edge case like things where EA goes off in like strange directions are what do I want to say? Like, I think they're ignoring the reality of like what humans care about, right? Like the total scope and sensitivity, for example, of like many EA folks is I think kind of a mistake, right? It is it's not totally like unreasonable, right? But it is like not like I think it is like not practically reasonable from like the way that we live our lives today. Maybe one day like we will have like enough abundance that being less scope sensitive will be possible. And I think like we see a trend over time that like greater abundance allows lower scope sensitivity, greater like expansion of the moral circle. I think that's great. I think we should do more of that. But I often think it's a mistake to immediately jump to like, okay, I have to cause like zero harm today. This like causes people a lot of like psychological distress and difficulty, and I think like pushes people in like weird directions. And I wish people wouldn't do quite so much of it. So that's kind of my critique there. Hopefully that's helpful. I'm sure other people have critiqued other things, then I am just not familiar with them.
Great. So there's another question in the chat from Jasmine, who says, you have mentioned that the process of enlightenment for you was seeing the layer through which you interpreted reality. Do you think enlightenment is a one-time process where you see through the one layer, or is it a continual process where you discover layer after layer? I guess in traditional Buddhist terms, Gordon, obviously this is sort of the whole question of like sudden versus gradual enlightenment.
Yeah. Happy to talk about this. I think that like it's both, right? Like I don't think there's like actually like an either or here. I think there is like there's a critical insight that happens. And sorry for anyone that is not like I will assume that most of you are up to speed on like what I'm about to talk about, but if you're not, apologies. So there is a critical insight that comes at the end of the path to what I would call like enlightenment, right? And this is the insight that there is no separation between self and other. Or at least that's how I would phrase it. Other people might phrase it other ways. This is like sort of this like final critical insight. Some people might like choose to phrase it like slightly differently, or would say that like there is a slightly like different but related insight that you have to have after this, but we can like elide those details and say that like there's that. Okay, so you have this insight, great. Your mental processes are like totally reformed by this, because your fundamental understanding of the world is now changed forever. And you, in fact, like, this doesn't mean that you're like somehow like permanently enlightened forever, right? Like you have crossed this like first barrier of like, hey, you finally cleared out all of the like cruft that was separating you from being able to engage with reality directly. But this doesn't mean that you suddenly start engaging with reality directly all the time. There's still plenty of opportunity to get lost in your own thoughts, to forget what's going on, right? I'm in fact doing some of it right now. I'm very focused on talking to all of you, which means that like there's a bunch of stuff that I am not paying attention to, that I am just like pushing out of my awareness, because I only have so much capacity to like engage, right? So like I can only like be so focused on so much stuff at once, right? And it is really this like continual process. There are all these like, I talk about them as like habits of mind. I think other people talk about them other ways, but there's just like all this stuff lying around. So, in some ways I kind of like try to avoid even using the word enlightenment, because although it's like this thing that people know about, there's really just like this continual process of like liberating yourself from your own like confusions that you're constantly heaping on yourself, just through the process of living life. The only way not to continue to heap them on is to not live a lay life. Like you have to go live in the monastery and just sit all the time, right? And like that's like an option. You can do that, but there's very few people that can live like a continually like liberated life, and continue to like free themselves in every moment from this stuff. The reality for most of us is like, okay, enlightenment is like, you like cross this barrier. Now you like don't have this like fundamental confusion anymore, but you still got to like wake up every day and like commit yourself to the practice of like staying awake.
Just a sort of brief follow-on question there, just to make sure I'm understanding what you're pointing out with the terminology that you're using, Gordon. Are you talking about sort of stream entry, or like what Michael Valentine's written about as kinsho, like that initial glimpse? Or are you talking about more of like the final, dying the great death, maybe in your terms?
Dying the great death. Yeah. I'm talking about dying the great death, right? That's like
where after this fundamental sense of separation never returns, and yeah, okay.
Right. Like the process from like stream entry to until you like die the great death, that is like, sort of like the path, right? As we sometimes talk about it. And it is like very important, but I'm in fact talking about like what happens after that.
Great. Let's go to Julia for a question here.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon, for the interesting presentation. I have a very practical question, actually.
Yeah.
Like, if suppose I were to shop for a good Zen teacher, what can you recommend?
Yeah, totally. Let's see. And you said you're in Switzerland, right?
Yeah, Zurich based, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. I know there's a lot of folks in Europe, although I feel like there's not as much. So I mostly know the Zen world, right? There is not zero Zen in Europe, but I know that there's a lot more of like other traditions in Europe than Zen. My general advice is to like, find someone who you feel like has their like life together, right? That's maybe like the number one thing is, there's like a lot of meditation teachers out there, and they like maybe they like tell you that like oh yeah, you like do this stuff and you like write it, whatever, but then like their actual own life is a mess, right? And like, okay, this person is like they definitely have some understanding. I would be very nervous about like taking letting them be my teacher and like being in that kind of like relationship with them. This is perhaps like very Zen of me, but I think that lineage is very important. It's very important in the sense that like their teacher has, certified essentially like this person understands and is like capable, like emotionally mature enough to teach. I think that's very important. I know that like not every tradition like has this or like feels the same way about it. So take it with a grain of salt, but I think that that's quite important. I'm not going to say that it's like perfect, right? I think that like no human institution is. And I think this is why it's quite tricky to find a teacher because, if you work closely with a teacher on this process of like waking up, you're quite vulnerable. You have to be very vulnerable with them, very open with them in order to make progress. They have to be very vulnerable with you. And that is, as any time you're in that type of relationship, it is possible to abuse it. So I think it's like very important to be careful here, pay attention to like your, intuitions. If you feel like, hey, this is not the right person, then they're probably not the right person. If you get like nervous about something, pay attention to that, notice that. And yeah, that's mostly my advice. Otherwise, it's just like go and try, right? Like that's, I think, like the best thing to do is like if you haven't found a teacher that you like yet, or a sangha that you're excited to be part of, just keep searching. There are tons of them out there. You will find the right thing for you. You just have to look.
Thanks.
Let's go to Elisa for her question.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first is, do you have a sense of how much your writings have helped people moving from a rationalist to a post-rationalist stage? And the second question is, how would the world look different if the average person was a post-rationalist?
Sure. On the first question, I don't know, right? Like it's kind of hard for me to figure this out. I know of like a handful of people who have told me that like they read things I wrote and it was like very important for them. And it was like, critical to like their thinking and like the development of their thinking. So, so I know that, right? But we're talking like 5, 6, 7 people here, right? Like, I don't know. So maybe there's more people. I don't know, right? I'd kind of like to think that there are, but although I'd also say that like, I try not to like have too many like delusions of grandeur here, right? Like the reality is that like I think to like, if someone is, let's say, a rationalist today, and they like get interested in post-rationality, it was actually going to be the culmination of reading things written by dozens of people that will be helpful to them along the way. You know, and no one person's writing is really going to be like, I think, sufficient. I know we all want to be that person, right? Or maybe as a writer, maybe not everybody wants to be this person, but as a writer, you know, it's very easy to like fall into this idea of like, I will write the thing that like wakes the world up or something like that, right? Or like whatever it is. And occasionally there are people that pull this off, right? I think Eliezer Yudkowsky is maybe arguably a person like this, right? He's written a bunch of stuff that pretty consistently, there are people that read it and their life is like radically transformed by having read his writing. And I know because I meet them all the time, right? They're many of my friends. So this is like, I won't say it's like impossible, right? But I think the reality is that it's a lot of stuff. And in many ways, you know, even someone like Eliezer, it works because he's building on a foundation that that people are coming in with that actually comes from a bunch of different people, right? It's not, you know, and he is like tying together a lot of sources, things that were written by other people, reusing like examples, arguments that they had worked out, you know, and then he's like taken them and made them his own. So, you know, maybe one day we will get the post-rationalist version of Eliezer, right? And like we will have someone will do this. You could maybe argue that David Chapman is this, right? But like I think it's like not quite there yet, right? I don't think it's like 100% working. The machine isn't working quite that way. So yeah, but anyway, I don't know. I think that's sort of where things are. And then in terms of, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, I'm bad at remembering.
Second part was, how would the world be different if the average person was a...
Oh yeah, how would it be different if the average person was a post-rationalist? Yeah, I like to think you'd be a lot nicer and kinder and more compassionate, right? And people would just be more reasonable about things. Yeah, I think, you know, maybe in my mind, people would be a lot more humble. I was talking to someone about this not long ago. They were asking like, you know, they asked me a somewhat related question. They were like, what's the thing you want everyone to like come away from reading your book, right? How do you want them to be different afterwards? And I thought about it and I realized that the answer was, I want them to have more epistemic humility coming out of it, of like deep epistemic humility, not like the surface level epistemic humility that I think a lot of rationalists have, which is like, oh yeah, like I'm going to put probabilities on things and like, you know, I like be like, you know, nominally uncertain about stuff, right? I mean, no, like actually being very deeply uncertain that like, you even know like what the hell is going on, that like, that you are even correct that like, you're a person, right? Or that like, you know, that, you know, here I am like drinking cup or water out of my like thermos, right? Like, is this a thermos? Am I even right about this, right? Like this, like, I'm not saying that like, you know, you need to spend all your time like navel gazing and going down some like very deep path of like introspection here and being like, you know, taking you in the direction of like psychosis or something. But that there's like a huge amount of like scaffolding that the entire way we interact with the world in every moment is built on top of. And people just take that for granted. And I think that being able to see that gives you this kind of like very deep humility that like everything that I think I know is extremely contingent. And that in some like fundamental sense, I don't know. I don't really know anything. And I think this is sort of like the end stage of like the post-rationalist project, is something like, I don't know anything, but I'm going to get on with my life anyway. And I like to imagine that this would make the world a much like, you know, more functional place. But I don't know. We'll see. Well, I don't know. I don't know if like the average person being like a post-rationalist is in the cards, but it could be interesting to see if it ever played out.
Thank you. If no one else has any other questions, I'll jump in with a follow-up. which is so you talked briefly. There was a question briefly about effective altruism, and you talked about utilitarianism. I'm wondering this kind of like fundamental uncertainty about the world, if you have any takes on how that impacts the effective altruism project and in general our attempts at doing good in the world.
Yeah, totally. One of my favorite quotes that I want to say that maybe this is like attributed to Anna Salomon, but I could be wrong about like in my memory here of who I originally heard this from, was that we're great at figuring out like the size of the impact of our work, right? We're really bad at figuring out the sign though. So it's easy to figure out that like, yeah, we're doing something, right? It's like having some sort of like impact on people. The question is always is this actually good or bad? And I think this is like quite tricky. It's like maybe just to like pick on an example, like cash transfers are maybe like a great example here, where like it's really hard to work out like what are all the second and third and fourth degree order effects of cash transfers. On the surface, it seems like great. Like people are poor, let's give them money so they can buy things and not be poor and like bootstrap themselves out of poverty. Sounds great, right? But there are a lot of interesting like second, third, order effects of implementing these sort of policies that are really hard for us to figure out. Like, and we might not know the answer for decades, right? If we run like a cash transfer program for a long time. And maybe the ultimate outcome is actually bad. Like, I'm not saying that it is, right? I am saying that like I hold like a decent amount of like uncertainty about this. And I feel this way about like a lot of stuff. There are some things that I think are a little bit more clear, are straightforwardly good, although even there I'm like, I don't know, right? Like for example, I think like work on animal welfare mostly seems good in terms of like making the conditions for animals in like farming settings, especially factory farming settings, better. Seems straightforwardly good, right? But even there I like hold some like uncertainty about like, well, I don't know, what are like the long-term consequences of this? Does this make like farming more palatable to people, and then like actually we like increase meat consumption because and farm more animals more aggressively because it's less bad, what we're doing? I don't know. It's like sort of hard to like game this all out. So that's where I like sort of say that we sort of just don't know.
So actually, I have sort of a semi-related sort of follow-on question to what Elisa was asking. So like you've written about epistemic circularity and the problem of the criterion, right?
Yeah.
So if we can't escape circular justification, like how does that inform how do we approach these questions about like what's good and how to do good? Like how do we know at the end if we can't escape that epistemic circularity?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, like, I should be clear that like the epistemic circularity that I've written about, and of course, this is my like book plug, right? Like, you should definitely read my book, right? Like, it's on the web. It's fundamentaluncertainty.com. You can like find the book there. It's currently in like a sort of like a preprint phase. There's like a draft of it that's available, and then like I'm working on the final revision of it now for publication. But yeah, essentially like this is a problem that exists within our system of reasoning, right? Like it doesn't actually exist in the world. It only exists because we've developed a system of reasoning that helps us like model the world, but it is a like artifact of that system of reasoning. And if we just don't engage with that, this problem kind of like disappears. Now, this is not like an argument for like disengaging from all rational thought. And I think that like this is like the thing that we have to be like careful about to not lose sight of. It is instead saying that like we can use rational thought to help us like work out details of stuff. It is a very useful tool. But ultimately, stuff is founded in all of our like beliefs and everything are founded in our experience, and that is where this all comes from. So it means that like if I'm looking for like for myself like what is important, and it ultimately comes down to like what do I care about, right? What do other people care about? I think that I'm very aligned with like maybe I'll get in trouble for saying these words for reasons, but like I feel like at least narrowly in this capacity I'm like very aligned with like Heidegger, that like care is like the fundamental thing. This is like the central thing at the heart of everything, of everything that like is a part of our lives, of like the way we understand it. Everything is built out of this thing that we want to that it makes sense to call care. Of like what is it that like we're motivated by, what is it that we are concerned with, what is it we are trying to achieve, and it all really like flows downstream from there. I don't know how much of an answer that is, but like that's my like sort of like abstract answer to the question.
No, that makes sense. And it kind of reminds me of what you were saying earlier about like, within sort of the utilitarian framework, like the utility itself is not sort of examined or explained. Like it's got to come from outside
Right.
the framework in a certain sense, right? Yeah, I do have one more question, but I'm happy to, cede to anyone else if there's any other questions. If not, I will just go ahead then. Yeah, so like I've read your sequence of posts on Zen and rationality, but I just kind of wanted to hear some more of your thoughts on sort of how you see post-rationality and Zen, or like how is, I guess maybe I was thinking like how has your Zen practice informed your perspective on sort of questions of post-rationality? Maybe that's sort of backwards, because from what the history you gave, it seemed more like maybe your examinations of post-rationality sort of led you into Zen practice to begin with.
I think that's.
I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about how you see, Zen or maybe Buddhism in general, or contemplative practice even more generally, like fitting in with these sorts of things.
Yeah, totally. I would say that like it's I came to like formal Buddhist practice mostly because I was reading about all this stuff. And then, sort of a thread that I haven't really like brought up here is I was also interested in like positive psychology stuff. How can I like make my life better by, applying various like sorts of like positive psychology techniques. This is like very also related to like the CFAR project and what they're sort of doing. They're fundamentally, I don't think they would frame themselves this way, but it's like a positive psychology project, right? Sort of came to this place of like, okay, I've got all these ideas, I've tried all this stuff, and like it's still not like, I can tell that there's more, and I don't know how to like do it. And so over the course of about a year of like, I don't know, searching around, I eventually like convinced myself that I think that like Buddhism basically is like the closest thing that we have to like a living tradition of how to integrate this stuff. And I'm not going to say that like this is true of like every strain of Buddhism, right? I think like some lineages are better at this than others. Some are like very explicit about it, some are not. I think for me, I took it as like there is like a set of stuff that Buddhists have figured out. They know how to teach it. That's the part I'm missing. And I need to engage with it. Now, I would say that like from having spent a lot of time in a lot of Buddhist spaces, that Buddhism is not the same thing as like meta-rationality or post-rationality, right? Like there are, in fact, like the vast majority of Buddhists you will meet in the world are like pre-rationalist, like pre-modernist people and thinkers. They are, I don't know, that's just the reality, right? Like, I don't mean this in any way to be like disparaging towards any of them. It is just that like they have not engaged, they have not yet fully engaged with, I think, like rationalist thought or like modernist thought in a way that would allow them to actually be sort of in this like post-rationalist, meta-rationalist, headspace. So I really see like there is sort of like this synthesis here of taking all these like parts together to build, I don't want to say like build a better Buddhism. I don't know that that's like quite right, but I think that there is something here where like we could imagine like a Buddhist tradition that integrates more of these insights from like the rationalist project. And I think there are some like teachers that do a bit of this. Shenzhen Young is probably like the first name that comes to mind in this space. But I think there's definitely other folks. And I think there's like opportunity here, right, in terms of like formulating a style of practice that is able to integrate both like the for myself, I see it as like integrating the sort of like anti-intellectual strain that exists within Zen, right? The sort of like primitivist strain that like is getting back to the fundamental reality of just being, and the benefits of like being able to apply rationalist thought to actually live our lay lives, because we are not going to just like sit on a cushion in a monastery. That's not the life for most of us. We have to live in the relative world, and living in the relative world means fully engaging with form, and that is like sort of the the culmination of what the rationalist project is like, how do I fully engage with form? And Buddhism is, how do I maybe like fully engage with the absolute and then integrate those two things together, the relative and the absolute together. So yeah, so I know we're like basically out of time, so maybe that's a good point to end.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. So I just wanted to say a big thank you one more time, Gordon, for joining us today. I found this super interesting, and can't wait to continue this conversation with you, or the conversations with you. And yeah, I guess before we sign off, I just wanted to tell everyone, if you have any thoughts or feedback, sort of about the speaker series, feel free to reach out to me or Finn or Elisa on WhatsApp. You can find our numbers in the Inte group chat. And yeah, we'd be happy to hear from you and sort of take your thoughts and opinions into account as we move forward. We will have we still need to finalize our pick of speaker for November, but there will be another event in November, so keep an eye out for announcement on that. And yeah, I guess we can leave it there. Thanks again, Gordon, for joining us today, and this was really great. Looking forward to seeing you all again soon.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much to all of you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.